Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Thank you for coming out this morning. Certainly nothing shows commitment to a public policy issue like waking up on a Saturday morning, carting off to Belmont to pack in a room to hear a couple of speakers talk about an issue that's very important to all of us. My name is John Cirasulo. I'm the chairman of the Beacon Center of Tennessee. Very proud to be associated with this fine organization. Justin Owen, our president and CEO, is in the back of the room there. We're very proud to host this event today. Off track, what's wrong with Nashville's transit plan and what we should do. Of course, we're talking about Mayor Barry's Let's Move Nashville transit plan that includes light rail, rapid bus system, and other bus enhancements for a total price tag of nearly $9 billion, making it the largest and most expensive project in Metro history. Voters will have their say later on this spring, and our goal today is to further the discussion and the debate over this very important topic. There's been plenty said in the media on the pro-transit side, and this is an opportunity for us to hear a different view. In fact, there are many eloquent proponents of the mayor's plan, as you can imagine, including the Chamber of Commerce and many of the large businesses in Nashville. And one of the, I think, more insidious things that are being promoted is that there's no plan B, that it's either the mayor's plan or total gridlock, mass hysteria, dogs and cats living together. And I think it's important to realize this is not a binary choice. It is not the mayor's plan or nothing. And one of the things I'm really proud of today is the second panel will be on exactly that. What are better options for Nashville? Our first panel this morning is what's wrong with the mayor's plan. And I'm very happy to have Ralph Bristol to be our moderator for the first panel. He's a voice that will be familiar to anyone who lives in shouting distance of Nashville, the longtime host of Nashville's Morning News, the premier drive time talk show in Nashville. We're very happy to have him, and please join me in welcoming Ralph.
Hi. Hello, Americans. Stand by for news. My name is Ralph Bristol. I am the very recently retired host of Nashville's Morning News on Super Talk 99.7 WTN. It's a post I held for 10 years, 10 months, and 9 days, but who's counting? That outlived 4 market managers, 4 sales managers, 4 program directors, and who knows how many other people, but nobody survives forever in this business. And I lasted long enough to actually prepare to retire financially, emotionally, and every other way, so please don't say I'm sorry, say congratulations. So my brother called me yesterday, the first words out of my mouth were, congratulations. I said, you're the first one to get it right. After being freed on Thursday at 11 a.m., it took me quite a while to decide what my next step would be. So it wasn't until Friday about 3 p.m. that I had lined up my first $5,000 worth of business for my new adventure, which is to continue, one of them, to continue to be the trusted radio voice of businesses worthy of that trust and admiration. Many of my sponsors, most of, if all of my sponsors meet that test. My first day of retirement, half of my longtime sponsors had already said they wanted to continue that relationship, so I thank them for that. It wasn't until Friday at 2 a.m. that I recorded my first daily podcast, which is going to be another one of my adventures going forward, which along with my commercial voice and writing work, my audiobooks that I'm writing and producing, first one soon to be released, some video production, including some original music videos, believe it or not, will keep me about as busy as I want to be in my retirement, premature though it may be. But that's enough about me. Let's spend the next 3 hours exploring this first crucial review, critical review, very first critical review of Mayor Megan Barry's $5.4 billion or $8.9 billion, wait a minute, Now the ticker says 12.85 billion with a target of 15.5. And that's including overruns. Got it? No, really. You'll soon be hearing that. Today we are going to hear from experts who are kindred spirits of the Beacon Center of Tennessee, which I knew prior to it being the Beacon Center, and I began to partner with prior to it being the Beacon Center. It played an oversized role in helping me keep the promise that I made to convince Mariana to follow me to Tennessee and marry me, which was that I would fight relentlessly to eliminate Tennessee's offensive, highest in the nation estate tax, which we did together. Thank you. And expose the lie that Tennessee was an income tax-free state while the hall tax still existed, which it now does not, thanks to the work of the Beacon Center of Tennessee and a lot of others, and I was proud to be part of that work. When this forum ends today, and the media seeks to balance its report on this forum, as they should do, Joey, thank you so much for being here. I do appreciate it. By getting a response from the proponents of the mayor's plan, they will hear the mayor's spokesman say that you should not put any faith and confidence in the opinions of out-of-town libertarian anti-government shills doing the bidding of the Koch brothers or some other free market capitalist trying to keep all of life's blessing to their own greedy selves. You don't have to ask the mayor what she thinks. I've already given you her quote. Ladies and gentlemen of the public jury, I'm here to tell you that the witnesses you hear today will back up everything they say with years of research, and where they fail, where they can't, you and I are going to challenge them in the Q&A session and not be afraid of exposing the weaknesses of their arguments, even as they expose the weakness of the in-motion argument. Another one of those plans that is pretty much the opposite of what it will actually do. Kind of like, on my way here today, I actually passed a 57 Edsel. How appropriate. So let the trial begin. Our first witness is Randall O'Toole. Randall is the Cato Institute Senior Fellow working on urban growth, public land, and transportation issues. Randall has written several books, with his most recent title, American Nightmare, How Government Undermined the Dream of Homeownership. An Oregon native, Randall does not like the weather in Oregon this year for some reason. Who does like this year's weather? It's different everywhere. My brother is complaining, he's 69 years old, he likes to ski in he's got ice instead of snow in New Hampshire, for crying out loud. He was educated in forestry at Oregon State University and in economics at the University of Oregon, and has spoken about free market environmental issues all over the country. One of my very, very favorite speakers on any issue ever in the country. From the Cato Institute, please welcome Randall O'Toole.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. I love any place that has geographic relief, which means I'm not too happy when I go to Houston or places like that, but I love rolling hills, mountains. I live in the mountains of Oregon. I also love trains. I want to make that clear to start with. I especially love passenger trains. This is a steam locomotive. It's the world's third most powerful operating steam locomotive. I helped restore it. I actually owned 5 passenger cars that we were restoring to run with this locomotive. By coincidence, this locomotive is a 1938 Baldwin, and so it's contemporaneous with the very first light rail line built in America, which was built between Oakland and San Francisco in 1938. And so light rail is as modern as that locomotive. Now, light rail, to me, I think it should be called lie rail, because everything about it is a lie. The very name light rail is a lie, because light rail weighs more than heavy rail. Subways and elevated trains are called heavy rail collectively, and a typical subway car weighs about 85,000 pounds, and a light rail car weighs 105,000 pounds. So light rail weighs more. So how is it light if it weighs more than heavy rail? Well, it turns out it's not lightweight, it's light capacity. By definition, light rail is low capacity transit, and yet the Nashville and Portland and other cities repeatedly call it high capacity transit. So they're lying right there when they call it high capacity transit. Well, how is it low capacity transit? After all, a single light rail car can hold 150 people, and you can string them together in 2, 3, 4 car trains, so you can have 600 people in a single train. Now, a train can't be any longer than a city block. Portland has short city blocks, so we can only have 2-car trains. Denver has 3-car trains. Salt Lake City has 4-car trains. I looked at a map of Nashville city blocks, and it looks like they were designed before somebody had invented the tape measure, because they ranged anywhere from 200 feet to 500 feet. So let's be optimistic and assume that light rail lines are only built along 500-foot long blocks, and you could run 5-car trains. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's going to be 3-car trains. But if you run 5-car trains, 150 people per car, the catch is, for safety reasons, you can only run 20 trains an hour, because otherwise they're going to be bumping into each other at stops. So that means you can move about 15,000 people an hour. That's tops. It's more likely going to be 9,000 or 10,000 people an hour. But the maximum possible is 15,000 people an hour. And for comparison, Portland and other cities has streets that move 160 buses an hour. And a typical bus can hold what's called an articulated bus, or some people call them bendy buses, has 60 seats and room for 40 standees, so it can hold 100 passengers. That means a street can move 16,000 people an hour on buses, more people than on the highest possible capacity, low capacity rail line you can imagine. And that's just a street. Istanbul, Turkey, has a busway that I saw when I was in Europe a couple of years ago, and they run buses every 14 seconds. And they aren't even running at capacity. They could run 300 buses an hour. And they have buses, notice this is a double articulated bus. It has 2 trailers. These buses can hold 200 people. But let's just stick with 100 people per bus. 300 buses an hour, you can move 25,000 to 30,000 people an hour. Twice as much as light rail. So light rail is low capacity transit. When do you want to build low capacity transit that costs you hundreds of millions of dollars a mile when you can run buses instead? Nowhere. No when, no time. Light rail does not make sense anywhere since the invention of the bus, which really means the invention of the diesel bus in about 1930. Now, Denver has proven this. Denver voters, unfortunately, agreed to spend $4 billion building light rail lines in 2004, and they ended up spending $7 billion building light rail lines because of cost overruns. But they also built one bus route, and it goes from Denver to Boulder. It's called the Flatiron Flyer, and it was the only one that didn't have cost overruns. It's the only one that met its ridership targets, and its average speed is 41 miles an hour. The average speed of light rail in Denver is 21 miles an hour. So it's twice as fast as the average light rail line, and it's also safer. Buses, unfortunately, kill about 3.8 people per billion passenger miles in collisions. Light rail kills 12 people per billion passenger miles. So light rail is 3 times more deadly than buses. So here we have something that's very expensive, can't move as many people, slow and unsafe. And that's the kind of thing that people want you to build. I think of light rail as the diamond-encrusted Rolex watch of transit. It's something that doesn't do as much as a real watch can do. It costs a lot more, and it serves solely to serve the ego of the people who are buying it. And that doesn't necessarily mean the taxpayers. It means the city officials who are hornswoggling the taxpayers into supporting it. Now, how well has light rail worked in other cities? You're going to hear all sorts of stories about how wonderful light rail has been. For example, last August, the Washington Post had a big article about how Los Angeles opened a new light rail line and they're teaching people to get out of their cars and ride transit. What they didn't mention is that in order to build light rail, it was so expensive they had to cut bus service. And the result was they lost 4 to 5 bus riders for every new light rail rider they gained. And in fact, the NAACP actually sued them and won because they were cutting bus service to minority neighborhoods to build light rail to white neighborhoods. And they stopped building light rail for 10 years. They were under a 10-year injunction to restore bus service, which they did. Bus ridership recovered for 10 years, and as soon as the 10 years were up, they started building light rail and they started cutting bus service again. And they started losing riders again. Portland is another place where you hear about light rail. It's the light rail mecca. Light rail is very successful there. Here's how successful it is. In 1980, before they built any light rail, buses moved 10% of all commuters to work in the Portland area every day. 10%. Then they built 5 light rail lines, 2 streetcar lines, and a commuter rail line. It's a lot like the Music City Star, meaning it's a huge failure. And thanks to that, the percentage of people taking transit to work is now all the way up to 8%. It's a great success. We moved it from 10% to 8%. In fact, the downtown is where most people take transit to work because light rail lines converge on downtown in a hub and spoke pattern. The percentage, the number of people taking transit to work downtown since 2001, there's been an annual census done, has declined by about 4,000 people a day. The number of people bicycling and walking has increased by 4,000 people a day. So people are now finding light rail to be so unsuitable that it's better to bicycle and walk to work than to take light rail. Meanwhile, notice the people driving to work has significantly increased. All of the new jobs in downtown Portland are people driving. People who used to take transit are now bicycling and walking. And this pattern has been repeated all over the country. You build light rail, you cut bus service, you raise bus fares to pay for the light rail, and you lose riders, you lose market share. Transit is a big failure. And it's not just light rail. Heavy rail has been the same problem in Atlanta and San Francisco. Per capita transit ridership in Atlanta has declined by 2/3. Per capita transit ridership in the San Francisco Bay Area has declined by 1/3 because they put all their money into a heavy rail system instead of buses. So, let's look at this in the context of Nashville's proposed light rail plan. Now, I've seen lots of numbers, but the numbers I can pick out for light rail is they want to build 29.9 miles, and it's going to cost them $4.3 billion, which actually isn't outrageous considering that there are cities that are preparing to spend $600 to $900 million a mile for light rail. Seattle and Los Angeles are both talking about spending that much. Light rail is supposed to be cheap transit. It was supposed to be cheaper than heavy rail. The first light rail line in America cost $20 million a mile, which turns out was a waste because they had to put a for-profit bus company out of business to be able to get any customers for their 4 lost light rail lines. But they want to spend $4.3 billion. Now, I like to play a game. I think everybody plays a game in our heads. What would I do if I were a billionaire? What would you do if you built $4.3 billion to spend on Nashville? Now remember, it's not going to be $4.3 billion. Every light rail line ever built in America has had a huge cost overrun, and the average overrun has been 50%. Many have been 100%. So it's not going to be 4.3, it's going to be $6.something billion, $6.5 billion. So what could you do if you had that money? Well, first of all, let's look at transit. You could replace every single bus in the Nashville system with a battery-powered electric bus. Could drive all day on a charge of batteries, and you could replace both the regular buses and the articulated buses, and you could double it. You could buy twice as many buses as you have today. You could double transit service, and for the next 20 years, you could pay all the operating costs of doubling transit service and have free buses for 20 years. for the cost of one light rail line, of your light rail plan. But what if you want to relieve congestion? Even if you double bus service, even if you fill those buses, it's not going to be enough people to relieve congestion because most people still want to drive. You have about 219 miles of freeways in the Nashville metropolitan area. That means you could, for the cost of light rail, you could add 2 new lanes to every single freeway. And the way to do it would be the way Tampa did it recently. They built an elevated expressway over the existing freeway. So it was not very expensive. You didn't have to buy right of way. It cost $7 million a lane mile. You could do that, add 2 lanes to every single freeway in the Nashville metropolitan area for the cost of the light rail. But what if you were concerned, instead of worrying about transportation, you're concerned about other things like education? Well, for the cost of the light rail, you could buy every single student in the Nashville Metropolitan School District an Apple laptop computer, which is what I advise everybody to get, not one of those Windows things. Have it fully loaded with all the software the students need to do their schoolwork. And we all know computers go obsolete, so you could buy a new computer for every single student every 3 years for the next 20 years for the cost of the Nashville light rail. Now, which do you want to do? You want to improve transit service? Do you want to build new freeway lanes? Do you want to buy laptops for every student? You don't have to decide. You can do all of them for the cost of the Nashville light rail. 29.9 miles of Nashville light rail. You could build 400 lane miles of freeway. You could double bus service, have free bus service for 20 years, and have new laptop computers for every single student in Nashville Metropolitan School District for every 3 years for 20 years for the cost of 29.9 miles of light rail. That's how stupid this light rail plan is, and I hope you'll be able to convey that to your friends and neighbors. If you want more information, just some self-serving plugs. I brought a couple copies of my book, Gridlock, along that discusses all these issues, and all the issues we're going to be talking about today, including driverless cars. And I've got a few copies for sale. It's a $25 book. I'm selling them for $20. I can tell you can get a Kindle version for $13, but if you want my autograph, you can have the autograph for $20 and have the book for free. I also have papers you can download, more than 24 papers at cato.org that I've written about these issues. And you can go to AmericanDreamCoalition.org, and it's a repository for hundreds of papers on land use and transportation issues. I hope you find them useful. Thank you very much.
Randall O'Toole, ladies and gentlemen. Been listening to him forever. Michael Sargent leads the, it's what you say, it's not how you say it. Michael Sargent leads the Heritage Foundation's efforts to formulate and implement free market transportation and infrastructure policies. His research analyzes the federal role in funding and overseeing the nation's transportation infrastructure. Maybe it's his research that has convinced the federal government finally that funding light rail like this is not such a good idea, and they pretty much let Mayor Berry know that they are not likely to be a partner in her adventure. She's counting on that, but when that doesn't happen, she's going to have to go to Plan B, which will probably be more taxes on Nashvillians. But I digress. Michael's commentary has been featured in the Washington Post, the Boston Herald, the Houston Chronicle, the Hill, the Fox News, but mostly important right here in Nashville, Tennessee. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Michael Sargent.
Good morning. First, I want to thank Beacon Center and Ron for having me. This is my second time in Nashville, so I should probably pull up the presentation actually. Unlike Randall, I do not have a Mac, so I'm not sure.
A good MC probably would have filled the time for him, but lacking one.
And it's always a pleasure to follow Randall as well. But while I think he dove into some of the specifics regarding light rail, and I think Ron will discuss more specifics about the local project, I think it's really important to take a step back and look at what's going on at the federal level, because the federal government tends to be a huge player in funding these types of transit improvements. And so I think we really need to take a step back and take a look on what's going on in DC. So first, I'll give some context on everybody's favorite issue, the federal budget process, and just take a look at kind of what the trends we're seeing in regard to the overall budget and how that affects transit, because this is really important in the coming years. Then I'll dive into the specific Federal Transit Administration programs that end up helping to pay for a lot of these projects across the country, what those are looking like under this administration, what we're expecting in the current year and the coming budget process. And then I'll take a look at what's going on in Congress. Spoiler alert, not all that much, but see what's going on this year, and then looking a little forward beyond, because there are a bunch of important deadlines coming up over the next couple of years. And so first, I don't need to tell you all the federal government spends a ton of money, about $4 trillion every single year. But what I think a lot of people don't quite understand is that most of that is transfer payments. Most of that is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and healthcare. And then when you factor in defense spending and interest we have to pay to service our $20 trillion debt, that only leaves 8% of the budget for pretty much everything else, all the domestic spending programs. And so out of that, the federal government spends $100 billion every year on all infrastructure, transportation and water. That's a lot of money. It's only 2.5% of the overall federal budget. When you dig even deeper and look at federal transit spending, it ends up being $12 to $15 billion depending on the year. So less than 0.5% of the federal budget. This is also really important because even though the economy has recovered from the Great Recession, for the most part, unemployment's really low, we are seeing a big uptick in the federal deficit due to overspending. So last year was $666 billion, and that's expected to hit $1 trillion within the next 5 years. And this is, I think, on the back of all lawmakers' minds when they're crafting a budget. They don't want to acknowledge it right now, but they know that eventually the bill's going to come due. And this is largely because those big transfer programs that I talked about, the entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, other health care, they grow on autopilot every year in the federal budget. They're not part of the annual appropriations process. And so for that reason, and because they're incredibly popular with people who vote, Congress generally does not touch them. Also, they have no control over the interest costs. And so what we're seeing is that these handful of programs account for 85% of the spending growth at the federal level. So as you can see in that chart, what we're seeing is kind of a squeeze on the rest of federal spending on things like domestic programs like federal spending on transit, which does tend to be appropriated every year at the federal level. And because those programs that are growing so quickly are so popular, when lawmakers need to kind of make some concessions when it comes to the federal budget, we see them slowing growth in those discretionary domestic programs. And so as you can see, they're still growing by billions every year, but much slower than the rest of the federal budget. And so that's kind of the context for federal transit spending. So we'll dive a little bit into kind of the more programmatic level as to how that money actually goes out the door. And so the Federal Transit Administration spends about $12 billion every year in its overall budget. And you can see how that's broken down in that top graph. And when it comes to building new capital transit projects, there are basically two main funding sources that localities can turn to. The first is the formula grants for urbanized areas. This has a dedicated funding source through the Highway Trust Fund. You pay 18.4 cents on every gallon of gasoline that you buy. It goes in the federal government black box. This is kind of outside the federal budget process every year, so it's a little more insulated from kind of the budgetary politics, and I'll get into that when I discuss that program. Then the other big funding source is the Capital Investment Grant Program, and that's that green portion in the top graph, and that is an appropriated discretionary program. So this is a lot more to do with kind of the federal budget process every year, the wrangling that Congress has to do over the amount of dollars. There are other sources outside the Federal Transit Administration that I'll go over real briefly here, but I'm not going to dive too deeply in. The first are called Tiger Grants. These are a remnant of the 2009 stimulus plan. They're supposed to be temporary. Surprise, they're still there. They spend $500 million every year, but they're open to all sorts of infrastructure projects, not just transit. And the maximum grant amount is $25 million for any given project. So it's relatively small. It ends up funding a lot of wasteful things, pedestrian promenades, lighthouse restoration, you name it. But on the whole, it's a relatively small funding source. Then there's also the availability of highway dollars that states are allowed to flex away from highways towards transit. That is a state level decision. It's obviously a zero-sum game. If you take money from highways, from these flex programs to build transit, then you have less money for highways. So I'm not going to dive too deeply in that, but that's kind of a state level decision that needs to be made. Then also worth noting, all programs are subject to reauthorization by Congress. That's not them actually spending the money. That's basically just checking the box and saying, okay, we're allowed to spend this much money up to this amount. The last authorization was in 2015. That's good through 2020. And so for the formula grants, that basically locks in their level of spending. So as you can see, it's relatively stable in the coming years from the graph below. But then for the appropriated projects like the capital investment grants, that's basically the maximum amount they can spend, no more than that. And so what you're seeing here is that's the absolute maximum that the federal government is going to spend on transit, subject to massive changes in the programs, which I don't think we're going to see. But so that's also important to keep in mind. And so digging into the formula grants for transit, this is kind of the largest single pot when it comes to federal spending on transit. It's about $5 billion per year. And like I said, that is from a dedicated fund, the Highway Trust Fund, from gas tax dollars that you all send to Washington. It does not need annual appropriations, so it's a little more insulated from kind of the tribulations of the federal budget process. But that said, it's apportioned by formula, and that takes into account kind of all the aspects of a transit agency, how many people it serves, how large the city it is, how many miles of fixed guideway they have. And so when you look at that map on the right, the deeper the shade of purple, the greater share of people commute using transit. And so that's those places, the major cities, where you would pretty much expect, those get the greatest share of these formula dollars. When you look at medium-sized cities like Nashville, cities 200,000 to a million people, out of that $5 billion, those medium cities are only apportioned $950 million. So then when you get down to it and you look at Nashville's share, it's only $225.5 million per year out of that $5 billion. And that does account.
22.5.
Yeah.
It says 22. You said 220.
Oh, sorry, 22.5. Sorry about that. Out of that $5 billion. So it's relatively small share that takes into account the growth of the city. There is a trigger. If a city is growing really quickly, then it gets more money. That's including that. So while we do expect to see that figure go up as Nashville grows, it would not significantly increase that figure. So when we're talking a $5 or $9 billion project, those formula grants do not get you very far to that figure. Also importantly, in the administration's budget for this fiscal year, they assume that the Highway Trust Fund spending conforms with revenues. That's an issue. Most people would budget like that, but that's an issue because Congress spends $15 to $25 billion out of the Highway Trust Fund, more than it takes in gas taxes. And so come 2021, they're going to run out of the cash they injected it with. And so the administration assumes that spending falls to revenues. That amounts to a 50% effective cut for transit programs. So that dollar figure could cut in half to $11 million unless Congress figures something out, which I'll talk about in a bit, but I'm not terribly optimistic. And so the next, I would say, more prominent funding stream for new capital projects is the Capital Investment Grant Program, also called New Starts because it is reserved for new transit projects, either building a new transit system like this light rail that we're looking at, or expanding existing networks through a new line or expansion of a line. And unlike the formula grants, which have a dedicated funding source and are distributed by formula, this is subject to annual congressional appropriations. And as we're seeing right now, the federal government does not have a budget passed for this fiscal year, which started in October. So it's really uncertain as to exactly how much money they're going to actually spend on some of these things. But the reason why this grant program is really popular with states and localities is because it ends up being a ton of free money when it comes to the share of the overall project costs. So generally, the capital investment grants will pay for 40 to 60% of the whole project cost, depending on the project. It's also discretionary in that it vests a huge amount of authority in the executive branch to decide how that money is allocated, which projects they decide are worthy of funding. There are some statutory criteria, but it generally comes down to agency priorities, and the executive branch decision as to exactly how that money is going to be apportioned among the hundreds of applications that they get every single year. And that's really important because this administration is taking a completely different tack when it comes to the capital investment grant program. In their budget for this fiscal year, they cut the program and said, we're not going to accept any new applications for new capital investment grant programs. We are only going to allocate funding for existing projects that already have a full funding grant agreement with the federal government. And that was not only reflected in the administration's budget, it's also reflected in its recommendations for the coming fiscal year as to allocate the capital investment grant funding. And you can see in the table right there, it's a huge departure from what we saw under the last administration. For last year, the Obama administration recommended $2.5 billion in total spending. This year, the Trump administration is calling for less than half that, $1.2 billion. When you dig deeper and look at just light rail and streetcar projects, last year, $1.5 billion roughly went out the door for those streetcar projects. This year, it's a third of that recommended by the administration. So just $500 million for streetcar and light rail projects. And that number of projects that they're funding also drastically decreases from 17 last year to just 6 this year. So we are seeing the administration take a fundamentally different approach to this kind of program. And because it is a discretionary program within the DOT, the Federal Transit Administration, they have a lot of authority as to what actually ends up being spent and what money goes out the door. So that's really important to keep in mind when you're going forward with a huge capital intensive project, that this money might not end up actually going out the door. Some other, I think, really noteworthy progress that the administration has made in regards to transit funding. I think this is really interesting to see. New York and New Jersey are building what's called the Gateway Project, and within that there is a $13 billion rail tunnel underneath the Hudson River. And the New York and New Jersey delegations had assumed that they had a done deal with the federal government. The federal government was going to pay for half of that cost with straight grants and then cover the other half with taxpayer-backed loans. Just a couple weeks ago, the Federal Transit Administrator sent a letter to the head of that project saying, we have no such agreement. Just straight up denounced it, said that we find this current 50 funding, 50% grant, we find that unacceptable, and going forward we're going to have to go back to square one. So they're going to have to rethink that entire project right now, and that's why Chuck Schumer is withholding a lot of hearings when it comes to administration appointees, because he wants that money, but they're not giving it up anymore. For this upcoming budget process, I would say expect much more of the same from the administration. We'll see their budget in the next couple of weeks. I would expect the same cuts to the capital investment grant program, and also eliminating that pot of money, the Tiger program that I mentioned at the beginning. And of course, what's also on everyone's mind, this big infrastructure plan we've been promised. What the administration is saying, they're going to spend $200 billion at the federal level, and that will incentivize states and localities and the private sector to shell out an additional $800 billion to get to $1 trillion in infrastructure spending. When it comes to transit funding, I think probably the biggest part of that would apply is called the incentives program. And like I just said, this is kind of structured, or we're expecting it to be structured, such that it will have federal funds basically held out and saying, okay, which projects can come to the administration with the most money that they have. They want to incentivize local projects to come with most of the project funded at the local level, and then the administration will give a maximum of 20% of the total project cost through that program. Again, it's only $10 billion per year. By only, I mean relatively speaking. And it's a complete departure, again, from existing practice for the capital investment grants, where the federal government will cover about half the project. We're looking at a maximum of a 20% project share. Also noteworthy is that no state can receive more than 10% of the overall funding. So it is going to be fairly spread thin over all the states if it ends up passing. Also really interesting, in a document that leaked earlier this week, the administration kind of offhand said that it will require value capture financing for transit projects. This is a method of financing that essentially relies on economic development around transit projects. It would require some share of that growth to go towards funding the overall transit project. This is not generally common in the United States. We see it in some places in Asia. So it's really a different tack when it comes to funding the infrastructure projects for transit, and also basically would require the city to really rethink overall development of the city, not just of the transit project. Then also noteworthy is that they're looking for projects that they can expedite delivery, for lack of a better word, shovel-ready projects, as well as those that use public-private partnerships. And so overall, from what we're seeing from this administration, it's really clear that business as usual is coming to an end. There's not going to be any more free money dealt out as loosely as we saw from the last administration. And just really quickly, what about Congress? They're the ones that have to sign off on everything. They're generally cool to the Trump administration's infrastructure proposal, and not really in any mood to cut transit funding. But that said, I would expect the House Republicans' budget to come out largely in sync with the administration. We saw this last year. This would include cuts to the Capital Investment Grant Program, as well as eliminating Tiger. And this is both from an acknowledgement in the Republican caucus that some of these programs are really wasteful, but then also because of that pressure on the discretionary budget that I talked about at the beginning. Basically, if you want to increase defense spending and cut taxes, not touch the big entitlement programs, and balance the budget, something's got to give, and that's these domestic spending programs. The upcoming legislative agenda is really unclear. They still not passed the budget for this year. The government might shut down again in February, so no one really has much of a clue as to what the priorities are going to be after that. And that includes the infrastructure plan. Members have been really reticent to start leading on this. They're waiting for the administration to come forward with a detailed plan that they can take and then stick their favorite projects in and run with. But everyone, of course, is hung up on how do you pay for this. That's always the question on the Hill, and that's what we're seeing now. They don't want to cut spending and they don't want to raise taxes, so the big question is going to be how you end up paying for it. Also, they might bring back earmarks to help maybe smooth the process for infrastructure spending. I think that politically that's a really tough look for Republicans in an election year. So even though a lot of people are talking about it, I would be really surprised if they do bring it back for this fiscal year, maybe after the election, but that's also something to keep an eye on. Also looking farther down the road, like I mentioned, the Highway Trust Fund, that dedicated funding source for highways and transit projects, that reauthorization comes due in 2020, and the fund is expected to basically not be able to fulfill its obligations under current spending levels because it will run out of that necessary funding in 2021. This is also a big issue for infrastructure spending, and I'm not sure what Congress wants to do about it. They don't want to cut spending, but then also they don't want to raise the gas tax. So what we might see is, like they did for the last bill, they might use a bunch of budget gimmicks and bail it out with general fund revenues, like they've already done for $140 billion worth of spending. But again, I'm not sure. But that's a really important deadline that you have to keep an eye on to see the future of what transit funding is going to look like. So I know you all were thrilled about hearing about the ins and outs of the federal budget, but I think that the main takeaway is just that based on fiscal trends, the administration's priorities in infrastructure funding, and then also just congressional uncertainty, I would not expect the federal government to be a big financial partner for big capital and transit investment projects. That's just the bottom line. I think that's a reality when it comes to the budget. Of course, there will be changes based on what happens in Congress, but I think barring any huge legislative changes, this is the truth that we're living with. And so with that, I thank you very much and look forward to your questions.
Michael Sargent, ladies and gentlemen. We have a half hour left for the first segment. We have one more speaker, and then we'll bring all three of them up for some questions. And then we'll take a break, and Justin will conduct the second forum. Ron Schultes is policy coordinator for the Beacon Center of Tennessee. He works to establish and advance Beacon's annual policy initiatives, conducts original research and analysis related to those policy initiatives. He once worked as a paralegal for an immigration law firm. So please don't tell me any of those stories unless you want them to be public. I'm not very good at keeping secrets, as Cumulus will tell you. They say insubordination, I say differences, irreconcilable differences in an editorial policy. You say tomato, I say tomato, let's call the whole thing off. So we did. Ladies and gentlemen, Ron Schultes of the Beacon Center.
Awesome. So once again, my name is Ron Schultes. I'm with the Beacon Center, just a few miles up the road from here. And before I get started, I want to do a quick audience poll. Who here, like me, has to sit on I-24 every morning and afternoon? Raise your hands. Not a lot. Okay. What about I-65? A few more. Okay. What about I-40? A few more. Okay. What about, I'll just say other. Okay. So mostly other in some of the interstates. You know, I think we're all seeing that, we've all heard the stats of how much Nashville is growing, about 100 people a day, right? That's because this is a great city and it has a lot going for it and a lot of opportunity. And those are some great things, but that growth does come at a cost, and one of those is congestion. And I think it's clear that we need to do something, just as John Sarasulo alluded to earlier. Right? We need to do something to make sure our city doesn't end up in total gridlock. Studies have shown the effects that has on GDP, quality of life, and everything like that. So the mayor has proposed a plan, and what I want to do a little bit today is kind of go through a set of questions on how we should analyze that plan. How should we be looking at it, and how it would affect us in our city? So in case you're just starting to learn about the issue or just need a quick refresher, I know it's been mentioned several times today, but the plan consists of 5 light rail lines, improvements to the existing bus network, several rapid bus system lines, as well as new transit centers throughout the city. Comes with mainly 4 tax increases and then applications for federal grants. And then must be approved by you guys, the voters, later on this spring on May 1st. So how should we think about this plan? Well, luckily the mayor already told us how. In a speech in October, she said that this plan wasn't free and that it is an investment in our future, quote. So, I don't know about you, I probably don't put enough into my 401k, so I'm not used to investing millions, if not billions of dollars. So I thought I'd consult some experts on investing. I don't know if there are any other Shark Tank fans here. I could just binge watch Shark Tank videos all day on YouTube. But I don't do it at work, I promise, Justin. And if you watch Shark Tank as investors, they know that there's a series of questions that you should go through if you're going to be looking to spending so much money, if you're investing in a product, a company, or a program. So let's kind of go through some of those questions. I think what you'll find is that they'll always ask, how much are we investing? What is the cost, right? What is that upfront capital? How long is it going to take for me to get my money back or to recoup that investment? How risky is it? What are the challenges that it faces? And then what can we expect on the back end if that project or that investment is successful? So let's start to go through those. So first of all, how much does it cost? Well, we already heard it was initially announced at 5.2, then they extended one of the lines to 5.4, and then in the most recent Transit Investment Program report that came out in December, it was actually released once you include all the operations and maintenance at $8.9 billion. The main source comes from 4 tax increases, a 1% increase in the sales tax, a 1.2% increase in the hotel tax, and a 20% increase in both the rental car and business tax. And then other source includes federal grants, as well as a small portion of funding from the airport and the Music City Center. Now, what does that really mean, though? We hear these numbers, and how does that affect our city? Well, first of all, we need to understand that these tax increases come at a price. It's going to affect things. It's the truth. First of all, you're going from a sales tax from the 10th highest in the country to tie to the first my old home, Chicago. I thought I escaped double-digit sales taxes. It also includes our hotel going from 6th to the second highest only after Atlanta. What does this mean, though, for each one of us? Well, it comes at an enormous price tag. If you break that down, that's $13,000 per person and over $33,000 per household. This is a big cost and a large investment for a city. If you already break down its debt, is already $15,000 in debt per person. This is a large price tag on top of that. Now, what you'll hear is that proponents of the plan will often cite a chamber study that 47% of our sales tax is paid by visitors and tourists. Sure. Okay, well, let's take that out then. If you take out 47% of the sales tax, you're still looking at $5,000 per person and $13,000 per household. This is a real cost. So every time you go to the grocery store, you get a beer on Broadway or anything else, you're going to be paying this. And so when people are struggling coming out of this recession to put food on the table, to put kids through college, these are real costs that they need to be thinking about over the next couple of years. All right. We've talked about how much does it cost. How long is it till we get our money back? How long is it going to take for this to pay off? Well, they've already announced that the end date of construction is 2032. That's assuming everything goes to plan. Okay? I want you to think about this. We're talking about how bad congestion is, and then we're going to add 15 years of construction congestion on top of that. Imagine if you're a small business owner in Nolensville Pike and you know that construction is going to start in 2024 and you're not going to see a free expressway until 2032. What effect does that have on you?
Shut down.
Exactly. However, that pain continues for longer. The taxes for the plan are supposed to come off in 2068. Now, I want to put that in perspective. Anybody here who was born in 1990 or later, please raise your hand. Anybody 1990 or later? Okay, so that's a few. I want to know, I just want you to know that means, according to average life expectancy in the United States, you're the only people that will be alive in this room when those tax increases come off. For the rest of us, you can expect to see these tax increases for the rest of your life. All right, what is the risk, though, with this investment? What are the chances? What are the hurdles that it faces? Well, Randall already alluded to this in great detail about the project overruns. In fact, a study by Northeastern University that I found said the average light rail transit goes over by 40%. So if we're talking 8.9, we're really looking at $12.5 billion when it's all said and done. As Michael already said, we're unlikely to receive federal grants, which account for 18% or $1.5 billion of the cost. Well, if that's not coming, that means those taxes probably continue even longer. Now, excuse me. It's true that our plan is asking for less than the average light rail plan. That is true, and we should, I guess, give the mayor's office credit for that. However, even if you ask for less, if zero is available, you still get zero. And I think the Music City Star really serves as a great pilot program for our city's demand and appetite for rail commuting. In fact, in 2006, when the Music City Star was created, the government estimated that there would be 1,500 riders daily, or 750 passengers. 1,500 rides daily in 2006. I want you to know in 11 years, it has never once, in one day, met that projection. At 1,300. In fact, for the first 3 years, it was about half that, at about 850. In fact, it was also the second least used rail line outside of Anchorage, Alaska. All right, there's a lot of risks, it's a lot of cost, right? If it is successful, if it is implemented, what can we expect on the back end? Well, we're going to be left with a slow and expensive train system. If you go by the math in the mayor's plan, it'll average 19 miles an hour. Also, we're going to have to continue to subsidize it. So even if you don't use the plan, it's expected to cost $100 million a year in operations and maintenance and only bring in $30 million in rail fare. So we have to subsidize 70% of the cost. I'll put that in perspective. If the mayor's plan says that it would take $13 to $15 per ride to actually make it self-sustaining. I don't know who wants to ride a train for $15 one way, and about $6 to $7 for the bus system. It also only really serves a small area. As Randall alluded, the wheel and spoke structure of it really only applies to tourists in the downtown area. And then there has been no estimates from the proponents of the plan as to how much it will actually affect congestion. So we're being expected and told at this point that we're going to be putting up billions of dollars for decades to come, and we haven't even been told what should we expect on the back end. The truth is not much. And I'll highlight one example. Honolulu approved a $5.2 billion rail line plan. Sound familiar? They've now been told that it's going to be $12.5 billion. And then they said originally it was going to reduce congestion by 18%. They've now downgraded that forecast to 1%. So more than doubled the cost and a decrease from 18% to 1% in actual effect. Now you may be saying to me, Ron, well, governments are not businesses. They have different goals. A business goal is to maximize profit, and a government's goal is to provide services to its constituents. And that's true, and I'll accept that. However, what I would still say is that a government has a moral obligation to be efficient with your tax dollars. It has to be efficient in those services that it provides. And then also, while we may have a moral obligation to provide transit and transportation to our citizens, that's not the only moral obligation we have. What about education, security through our police and firefighters? These are real priorities as well. And the truth of the matter is, if we decide to allocate so much of our city's financing to this plan over the next couple of years, that's going to crowd out other systems. And I'll just put this in context. The average starting policeman in Nashville makes $50,000 a year. We could hire 1,000 new police and pay their salaries for 179 years in comparison. Or we can nearly double the amount of teachers in Metro Public Schools and pay their salaries for nearly 35 years. Think about 2 generations of kids that have class sizes half the size. Just an alternative, I'm just saying. So as alluded to, John did at the beginning of this, we admit that something needs to be done. However, that doesn't mean we have to accept the first proposal that we're given. That would be like marrying the first person you ever went on a date with. Now, in full disclosure, I did marry the first woman I ever asked out on a date because I knew I wouldn't do any better, but full disclaimer. Or I'll put it this way, imagine if you could only buy the first car you test drove, right? we should demand better solutions, more efficient solutions from our public servants. So with that, I'm all wrapped up.